Hello and welcome to the World History Addicts podcast. I'm your host, Devin, and today we will cover one of the lesser-known chapters of American history in the state of Indiana that often flies under the radar. From the early history of the state to what may be the strangest series of events at the height of the Cold War, let's begin. So for some background, where is Indiana and how did it start? Indiana is a Midwestern state. It's just to the south of Lake Michigan, and it borders the other Midwestern states of Illinois, Tennessee, Ohio, and of course, Michigan. Indiana was populated by people known as the Paleo-Indians, or post-Ice Age nomadic era people who arrived around 10,000 years ago in the region after the melting of the last glaciers. And from 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, these original inhabitants of the Great Lakes began creating mounds and early landfills called middens. And 4,500 years ago, the woodland period began, and it saw the start of ceramics and pottery alongside crops like corn and squash being farmed. 3,000 years ago, the Mississippian culture began, and it would continue up until the 1400s, where it mysteriously collapsed inside of what's now Indiana for reasons still unknown. Well, there was massive European exploration, conquest, and even incorporation in the Caribbean and in equatorial America, both in North America and in South America in the late 1400s and even up to the late 1500s. The Great Lakes was largely unknown to the Old World until the late 1600s. In fact, the first Europeans to visit the region and interact with local indigenous people were the French in 1679, who contacted the local Algonquin-speaking people known as the Shawnee, Miami, and Illini. The French were there to trade furs to be sold back in Europe, so they weren't interested in conquering the native people or taking all their land, so they cooperated into the 1750s, where the tribes of Indiana sided with the French against the British in the 7 Years' War, though the French eventually lost. The British tried to restrict settlement by Europeans in Indiana, which it called Indian Territory, largely because they didn't want to keep starting wars with the local people that would just cost more money and more soldiers, so they just decided it would be best to make peace with them. But then the British lost during the American Revolution, and the United States began expanding into and incorporating what's now Indiana in the 1780s. And by the 1790s, Native American control of the land really started to disappear. First with the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, and after the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, where the U.S. claimed large parts of Indiana for white settlement. In the 1810s and 1820s, the U.S. government removed all control of the land by Native Americans with the Treaty of St. Mary's in 1818 and the Treaty of Mississauga, also known as the Treaty of Wabash, in 1826. Indiana would later become the first state to mobilize troops against the Confederate States of America during the Civil War in 1861, and it lost around a third of the men it conscripted, though later Indiana would also become a major center for the KKK in the 1920s. The early 20th century saw a massive transformation in Indiana because it became a major manufacturing hub, and this was especially important in World War II because Indiana supplied war materials for the U.S. militaries, particularly in steel and vehicles from its growing industrial plants and food from its many farms. So when does the strange and hidden history of Indiana begin? Well, in the 1950s, the U.S. government began a series of controversial and inhumane experiments under the umbrella of MKUltra, where subjects, including American citizens, could be experimented on with drugs and electroshocks, along with hypnosis and sleep deprivation, among other types of stimuli that could extend into actual torture. And this was done for the practical end of countering Soviet research into the human mind and potential spying capabilities for telepaths or psychics, as it was believed that under extreme pressure, the human brain can begin to manifest special powers that even today are unknown to science. Indiana also took part in these experiments where children from mothers who had been experimented on or taken drugs would themselves be given drugs and be experimented on to see if they gained any kind of new mental abilities, and by the late 1970s, a lab in Indiana had a test subject who began showing incredible psychic powers, unlike any other test subject they had experimented on before. But in 1973, in a series of incidents still not entirely disclosed, that test subject broke free from captivity and in doing so created an opening to a parallel dimension that began to leak strange creatures which entered the surrounding town. According to notes from the local police chief, a young boy went missing the same night as the appearance of strange creatures along with blackouts and power grid fluctuations. There's also a mysterious incident where a girl from the local high school was reportedly attacked by one of these creatures and vanished, and she was never recovered. The friends of the missing boy later met the escaped test subject, but she had been referred to only by her designated number inside the lab for years and introduced herself as 11, or L for short. As this was going on, a cover-up was in progress, as the lab she had escaped from, known as the Hawkins Energy Lab, began sending agents to eliminate witnesses who had come into contact with 11, as well as make it appear the missing boy named Will Byers had drowned in an accident at the local lake. And it was headed by a scientist named Dr. Martin Brenner, and he was also the same handler who had given 11 her name. The three friends of Will, known as Dustin Henderson, Lucas Sinclair, and Mike Wheeler, kept Elle hidden while Will's mother Joyce and the police chief of Hawkins, Officer Jim Hopper, made a deal with Dr. Brenner to enter the mysterious dimension that had been called the Upside Down and find Will. Dustin, Lucas, Mike, and Will were major fans of a game called Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D, which they were playing just before Will's abduction by a monster they decided to name the Demogorgon, after a monster they were fighting in their latest campaign of D&D. Specific details of the incident and what this creature looks like are kind of difficult to come by because there are only a few declassified images of a Demogorgon, but they appear to be tall, amphibious-looking humanoid creatures with a flower-like face made up of petals that are covered on the inside by teeth. According to the declassified reports by the Hawkins Police Department, Will Byers was recovered from within the Upside Down around the same time that 11 and Will's friends were cornered by Dr. Brenner's agents, and the Demogorgon inside of the Hawkins High School, where 11 managed to kill the Demogorgon along with Brenner's men, but she also vanished along with the doctor. Will made a recovery, but he was constantly plagued by terrifying visions of a strange spider-like creature that seemed to be manifesting itself into Hawkins, which his friends decided to call the Mind Flayer, also based on a D&D monster. Despite Dr. Brenner's disappearance, the Hawkins lab continued to experiment on the portals to the Upside Down, with a new head scientist named Dr. Owens in charge instead, who was much more cooperative. 11 was also rumored to have been trapped in the Upside Down after she took down the Demogorgon, but she was actually living with Jim Hopper, though police records in Chicago claim 11 was sighted there in the company of a gang of delinquents. Back in Hawkins, Will's brother Jonathan and Jonathan's girlfriend Nancy Wheeler, also Mike's older sister, met with an eccentric conspiracy theorist named Murray Bauman, who was actually there because he was a private investigator sent to investigate the disappearance of Nancy's friend Barbara, who was the girl from the high school I mentioned earlier. And he was also there because he believed that there were Soviet agents spying on people in Hawkins, though he wasn't able to prove this was true until much later. He talked to both Jonathan and Nancy, and he convinced them to leak what they had found about the Hawkins lab, but to do it in a way that sounded believable. He told them to remove any references to Demogorgons or Mind Flayers or monsters and just replace it with unethical chemicals and pollution that were being released around the town, then were leading to people getting hurt. Will's condition was getting worse because there was a series of tunnels underneath Hawkins that had mysteriously opened up, and they're filled with these strange vines and tentacles and other mold-like growths. And whenever they were burned away, Will would actually feel himself getting burned. And it was because the Mind Flayer had actually injected itself into Will's mind, and he could now feel whatever happened to the hive mind that the Mind Flayer was attached to. But the Mind Flayer could also see through Will's eyes, and he could actually spy on people using Will. And at some point, Will actually had to be quarantined and put right next to a fire and surrounded by heaters in order to burn the Mind Flayer out of his head. According to military after-action reports, an army of juvenile demogorgons called demodogs gathered together from the tunnels, and they attacked the Hawkins lab, and they overwhelmed the security guards, and they had to be lured away by burning the tunnels. And after this, 11 and Hopper then had to go underneath the Hawkins lab and shut the main gate to the Upside Down before the U.S. Army arrived and shut it all down. That also leads to the question of, how does this relate to the Soviet Union and the wider Cold War? Well, about a year after the closing of the main gate, Nancy's ex-boyfriend Steve Harrington and his coworker Robin Buckley, along with Dustin, uncovered an illegal Soviet lab that had been built beneath the massive new shopping center called the Starcourt Mall in Hawkins with the help of a corrupt mayor named Larry Klein. The Soviet Union was also experimenting with the Upside Down, and they'd even built a machine underneath Hawkins that was capable of opening portals to the Upside Down. They had actually tried this back in the Soviet Union, and it didn't work very well, so they believed that correctly that they actually had to be inside Hawkins for this to work. So Dustin, Steve, Robin, and Lucas' younger sister named Erica all entered the lab before the Soviets captured them, and they had to be rescued by Jim Hopper and Joyce, along with Murray Bauman. who at this point had been proven correct when he thought that there were Soviets hiding out in Hawkins. On a more disturbing note, the Soviet machine also opened the Upside Down and allowed the Mind Flayer to re-enter Hawkins, and it possessed a well-known popular student named Billy Hargrove, who had recently moved there, and it used him to recruit people and bring the entity people who were then melted along with other animals like rats, and it used their blood and their liquefied flesh to create a creature that looked kind of like the spider-like Mind Flayer, and it rampaged through Hawkins, killing people. This monster eventually attacked the Starcourt Mall before being stopped by Eleven, though it also killed Billy in front of his younger stepsister, Max Mayfield. Hopper, Joyce, and Murray fought through the Soviets guarding the machine, and after shutting it down and closing the gate, Hopper was knocked out and captured by the Soviets and sent to a prison camp in Siberia. So what happened to Hopper, and how did the Soviets inside the USSR itself act on their knowledge of another dimension? Well, since the fall of the USSR, we have since learned from a few documents that the Soviets continued to experiment on captured Demogorgons and even allowed them to eat human prisoners in order to make them stronger. Jim Hopper himself actually evaded being killed by a Demogorgon that was set loose on inmates, and with the help of Joyce and Murray, he managed to make it back to the U.S., and though he was betrayed multiple times along the way by a guard named Grigory and a smuggler named Dmitri, but despite all that, he still managed to get back. It also appears that the Russian Federation has released a few documents that says the Soviets were actually aware of the Mind Flayer itself. They just weren't really sure of what it was, who it was, or what it was capable of. And there isn't much more information on Soviet experiments involving the Upside Down, so it appears that with the recovery of Jim Hopper from Siberia and the shutdown of their base in Hawkins, the program to turn the Upside Down and its various monsters into a weapon against the Americans were abandoned. So did the end of the Soviet lab and the experiments of the Hawkins lab and the paranormal events? Unfortunately not, because while the Hawkins lab was shut down, Dr. Brenner remained alive, and he continued experiments with 11 under the new program known as Nina. However, the appearance of a new entity from the Upside Down in Hawkins that had, on its own, managed to break into Hawkins started using psychic powers to kill multiple teenagers and led to a military officer named Colonel Jack Sullivan assembling a team to hunt down and eliminate 11 because he believed 11 was doing this. And he also wanted to eliminate pretty much anyone connected to the Hawkins lab because he just didn't want anything like the Battle of the Starcourt Mall ever happening again. This entity was later named Vecna after another monster or creature from D&D. But as it turned out, Vecna was actually a fellow member of the Hawkins lab. He was originally a boy named Henry Creel with psychic abilities who began to exhibit psychopathic tendencies in the 1950s. He started viewing himself as being above other humans, and he wanted to kill off weaker beings. And he killed his own family in 1958. Henry also massacred other test subjects in the Hawkins lab in the 1970s and was struck by a psychic attack by 11 that opened a gate to the Upside Down for the first time. And it turned him into Vecna. He was reported as looking like a hulking figure with melted flesh and a skeletal face covered in the same kind of tentacle-like growths that are very common around the Upside Down. And they move in a wrapping motion around his body, so it's always kind of crawling. While he was in the Upside Down, Henry also met the Mind Flayer, and the two began cooperating to take over Hawkins. Henry, now Vecna, started to kill off teenagers in Hawkins. He killed a girl named Chrissy Cunningham. He killed a fellow student of Nancy's named Fred Benson. He killed a friend of Lucas named Patrick McKinney, and temporarily he actually killed Max Mayfield, but they managed to keep her on life support. And these 4 deaths opened a gigantic series of rifts and cracks in the ground around Hawkins, and it allowed the Upside Down to surge in before being contained by the military. Nancy herself, along with Robin, Steve Harrington, and a few others, managed to break back into the Upside Down, and they managed to kill Vecna by burning him with firebombs, though the invasion continued, so it was unclear whether Vecna was truly stopped or if he just went back into hiding. So in conclusion, what can we learn from this obscure and very, very strange episode in American history? Well, the Cold War was a very strange time because both superpowers were willing to go to extreme lengths in terms of the cost, like money and human suffering, in order to advance their goals and counter expansion of the other superpower. Science can often uncover some truly horrible things, like it uncovered gunpowder and explosives and also the atom bomb, but it also uncovered a mysterious and hostile world in a parallel plane of existence, ours, filled with terrible monsters and evil beings that despise humanity itself. We can also learn that the nature of Vecna as a former human psychopath with telekinetic powers should remind us that even as monsters and horrible creatures exist outside of our world, some of the worst monsters are human in origin and are very much from the same world that we are. And we can also take away from this that information can be censored and blocked pretty easily by the government if they really wanted to be. But we can also learn that while governments can scheme and commit atrocities and make some pretty catastrophic mistakes, all it takes is a few determined individuals to save the day. And most importantly, what we can learn from all this is don't believe everything you hear on YouTube. April Fools! Thank you for listening. You can follow us at World History Addicts Podcast on Instagram for more releases and content. Also, be sure to subscribe to my friend Dwan's podcast at the Entertainment Fanatics Pod, which is also on Instagram. Stay tuned for more episodes, and happy April Fools.